So, Chris, I have two or three questions for you actually on bridging the IT business communications gap. So, can you explain why communication between IT and business teams is often challenging and what the core issues are to begin with?
Yes. And this is a core focus for me, having lived it on both sides of the divide for many, many years. And some of the reasons why, and the most common reasons we have this gap and the challenge between IT and business, is a different mindset, different language, and different expertise in whichever teams we're talking about. And what I mean by that is take a software development team talking to the business users of the software that they build. Each team has a different level of need for specificity. They have a different level of need of ambiguity, particularly when starting a software development project. So let's say it was a marketing team and they were talking about what they needed. The marketing team has an idea of what they're trying to do at the end, but they don't have specifics. On the flip side, the software development team is all about specifics. Their mindset is about detail, it is about the logic, it is about specific requirements. And the marketing team isn't ready at that point to get to that level of detail. And that's not a failing of the marketing team. And it's also not a failing of the software team to be wanting the detail. It's a natural consequence of what drives those expertise areas. And then we bring in the different languages. Marketing experts will talk in marketing terminology, and the software developers will talk in software terminology. And that difference in language causes a breakdown in communication, or in fact, a breakdown implies that there was a link in the first place. What it actually causes is two teams speaking different languages and not being able to bridge that gap.
So, Chris, then what would you say are some of the common misconceptions of IT professionals, or I should say that some of the common misconceptions IT professionals have about business teams and vice versa?
Well, if I'm in IT, my perception, and I'm generalizing here, so I should start with a caveat of not everybody thinks these things. But if we're going to talk in broad strokes, which can be helpful, I, in the software side or in the IT professional, would say, well, business teams ask for too much. They have no idea of how long things take. They have no idea of complexity or what's even possible. They're vague. They change their minds too much. They don't know enough. And the list could go on. That's the problem with those pesky business people. And then if I was to flip it around, what the business teams often think is, well, those IT folks, they're too rigid. They are unwilling to give estimates. They need way too much detail before it's available, and they just talk in jargon. I don't understand them. And those are what each team may believe. And unfortunately, while that's the evidence of what we see, it's not the root cause. It's not what each team is. It's what I mentioned before, the mindset, the language difference, the need for different levels of granularity in the detail that they share. So they're common misconceptions, even though it feels like it's the world that each team is living in.
Got it. So, Chris, I intentionally ask you about, what's the core issues and then what do some of these misconceptions look like that kind of create this core issue. But how do you assess the extent of the gap, or can you? That is, how can organizations assess the current state of communication between their IT and their business teams?
Well, I laugh because the tongue-in-cheek answer is, well, just ask each team what they think of the other team.
Right.
And if they start talking in stereotypes, like I just did, if they start talking in stereotypes, there's a problem. If they talk about people by name, so if you're talking to one of the business teams, and they start talking about their supporting IT team, but they mention people by name or by the situation. And if they do it in a collaborative way, then the communication is good because they're dealing person to person, not them and us, and using that team label. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned assessing, and I joke that we should just ask. One of the reasons that's not such a silly answer is there are hundreds of supposed team communication tests, but there isn't a formal test of comms alignment or comms breakdown. And I wish there were. I suppose, well, maybe I should come up with one and I could standardize it across the world. But there isn't one core test. The best way to assess the communication between the teams is to have a very candid conversation and listen to how they talk about each other.
So And I have to imagine, Chris, obviously that takes practice. That takes, you got to be deliberate, right? You got to have the intent to listen in a way that's helpful to understanding the extent of that gap.
Yes.
Um, so, I intentionally ask you, when it comes to bridging IT versus business communication gaps, what are the issues to begin with? And then what are some of the common misconceptions? And then how can you assess that gap? Is it better in some organizations than others? And I would have to imagine that, yeah, there's a range of that gap.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I think my next question then is, let's assume my organization has a significant gap. And based on your experience, what's the first step towards improving that gap or this communication?
Well, the first step would depend on how bad the breakdown is and the root causes. So if there's a complete lack of trust and the teams they're almost verbally fighting with each other, then you have to approach that in a different way to the teams just don't understand each other. So I'm going to answer the question from the perspective of things aren't terrible. There's no fighting. There's just a lack of understanding. And to address that, the first step is for each team to learn how to speak the language the other teams will understand. Now, for example, an IT team should talk to their business teams to find out what the business team calls the system and process that the IT and technology supports. For example, if the business team says, oh, we work on the sales system, then the IT team should call it that. They should call it the sales system when talking to the business team. Even if it's made up of a dozen system layers, databases, APIs, all of that stuff in the background, never talk about that to the business team. Learn what the business team calls the system and then use that language. And if they do it, the business team will understand it better, particularly if the IT folks then say, hey, there's an issue with the sales system, rather than there's an issue with the JSON between system X and system Y.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
because that's meaningless. It's the wrong language. So learn to speak in the language the other team will understand. And the onus for that, the pressure is more on the technical folks because you're not going to teach business to speak IT. But the good news is business labels things pretty simply. So it only takes one or two conversations to be able to understand and find out, what does the business team call this process? And then that gives a very common language that both sides can use and understand.
Yeah. For effective communication, you have to be on the same, you have to have the same language, right?
Absolutely. And the words really, really matter.